Republican Rome is dead. Long live the empire. We last saw Rome in the Punic Wars when it was the Mediterranean superpower. But that was then, and this is now. A lot has changed. Now, in addition to the rich becoming richer and the poor becoming poorer, the gap between the ideal citizen soldier and the reality of an aristocrat with little interest in civic duty has grown even wider. Rome is also stuck in the Middle East, and it's not going well. And a series of internal crises have broken out in the Republic, which may or may not be. So let's talk about it. Well, first we need to address the elephant in the room. If you've been following along for a while, you know that I have a very particular way of presenting these videos, one that has proven to be very popular. Unfortunately, there are some limits to how far I can push that format, and today is one of those limits. There is just so much that happened after Caesar's death that if I try to make each individual event a character in its own right, we would be here all day. So instead, what I'm going to do is treat this video as more of a survey of the period, touching on the major events and figures, but not trying to make each one a star of the show. This doesn't mean that the video will be less interesting or entertaining, just that I won't be able to linger on every detail the way I usually do. Anyway, hopefully this is a temporary situation and we'll be back to normal next week. Anyway, the last time we talked about Rome, we were still living in the golden age of the Republic, but by the late 2nd century BC, serious problems had begun to emerge, not the least of which was the increasing disparity of wealth between the rich and the poor. To understand why this was such a big deal, let's talk about where the money was coming from. Roman land was worked by slaves who were either prisoners taken in war or, increasingly, people who had been reduced to servitude due to debt. As a result, the vast majority of the agricultural work in Italy was done by people without any property, making them extremely vulnerable to exploitation. At the same time, the number of wealthy landowners was growing rapidly because of how much money Rome was making from conquest. And the trouble was, there wasn't really anything these people could spend their money on back home. Italian agriculture was already very developed, so there wasn't much opportunity for investment there. Public works projects could absorb some of the surplus, but not nearly enough. And so most of the extra money just ended up circulating among aristocrats, inflating property values and making the rich richer. But that wasn't the only economic pressure building within Rome in order to keep the army strong. Rome maintained a system of compulsory military service. Every year, eligible male citizens would be assessed for property and assigned to one of 5 classes based on their value. Class I, the richest class, had the fewest obligations and only had to pay for their own equipment. Class 5, the poorest class, got free weapons and armor provided by the state and also got food rations while they were in the army, since soldiers were expected to own their own horses. 2, this system effectively barred the very poorest men from serving in the army. For centuries, this didn't really matter because Rome never had any trouble raising enough troops. But in the 2nd century BC, that started to change. Much of the growth in the Republic's population and wealth was coming from conquered territories rather than from Italy itself, meaning fewer people were technically eligible for military service. And what's worse, Rome was starting to fight more and bigger wars, which meant more demands on the army, especially during the protracted conflicts with the Macedonian and Seleucid empires in the east and the prolonged struggle against Carthage in the west. As a result, there weren't always enough volunteers to go around. This led to an increased emphasis on the lower property classes to fill the ranks, which wasn't exactly a recipe for military success. After all, Class 5 soldiers got their armor paid for by the state. But that didn't necessarily mean they were more loyal to the state than someone who bought their own. This culminated in Gaius Gracchus's attempt at land reform in the early 130s BC, which aimed to relieve land from the rich and redistribute it to the poor. It failed, leading to civil war. And over the next several decades, this agrarian problem flared up again and again, driving a wedge between the classes and turning the army into a political tool. The first to really exploit this trend was Gaius Marius, a brilliant general who came from a relatively low-ranking family. He was elected consul in 107 BC, and used his influence to get himself appointed to the command in the Social War, a conflict between Rome and a coalition of its Italian allies. Seeing an opportunity to advance his own interests, Marius disregarded traditional methods and created a professional standing army, complete with salaried soldiers and year-round training, all of whom were bound to him personally rather than to the state. With the backing of his new army, Marius crushed the Italians and returned to Rome as a hero. Now, normally, the command of an army would pass to the next consul after a successful campaign. But Marius wanted it to stay in his hands, so he refused to relinquish his command and pushed for a second consulship. This would break with tradition and set a bad precedent, but it was hard to argue with success. And so, in 106 BC, Marius became the first person ever to serve 2 terms as consul in a row. The precedent was set, however, and many followed. The most notable of these men was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, another brilliant general who built his own personal power base through the army. Sulla's first clash with Marius came in 88 BC when the Senate awarded the command in the First Mithridatic War to Marius rather than to him. Despite the fact that Sulla was already in the middle of a successful campaign of his own, furious, he marched his legions into Italy and laid siege to Rome. While the city was occupied by Sulla's forces, a triumvirate of aristocrats known as the Optimates emerged to try to restore order. Chief among them was a man named Cinna, who managed to defeat Sulla and flee to Greece. This prompted Sulla to launch the First Roman Civil War, which he easily won, marching on Rome a second time and executing the leaders of the opposition. From there, he left the administration of the Republic in the hands of a former ally, Crassus, and went on to finish the war in the east. As it turned out, though, Sulla had made a mistake by trusting Crassus. Upon returning to Rome, he discovered that Crassus had seized power for himself. So he did what any reasonable person would do. He declared civil war yet again and beat Crassus's forces in battle. Despite this victory, he wasn't interested in seizing power for himself and willingly gave up his command. However, this third civil war would prove to be the deadliest yet. On one side was a rising young politician named Gaius Julius Caesar, whose father had supported Sulla. On the other was Gaius Marius the Younger, no relation to Caesar, who supported the war was brutal and resulted in thousands of casualties, including the death of Marius the Younger. But ultimately, Caesar emerged victorious. In 79 BC, he took his victorious army to Spain to put down a revolt and came back 3 years later as a full-fledged general. In fact, the spoils of war included a huge amount of treasure, which he used to finance his own campaigns across Europe. By 58 BC, he was arguably the most powerful man in Rome, having defeated the Helvetia, the Belgae, and most of the Aedui, conquering territories that would become known as Gaul. His rivals back in Rome tried to force him to disband his army before returning home, but Caesar refused, crossing the Rubicon River with his legion and beginning a civil war against Pompey the Great, who commanded the official Roman army. As it turned out, Caesar's private army was a bit too professional for Rome to handle. In a few short years, he had defeated Pompey and seized control of the entire Mediterranean. And so in 49 BC, Caesar was proclaimed dictator, making him the de facto ruler of the Republic. To some degree, he did try to address the agrarian crisis, granting citizenship to the Italians and redistributing some of the wealth of the upper classes to the poor. But he was assassinated by a group of senators led by his former friend, Brutus, who thought he was becoming too powerful. In the aftermath, 3 men emerged to divide the Republic among themselves: Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, forming the second Together, they put down Sextus Pompey's naval revolt, defeated the remnants of Caesar's opposition, and waged war against Parthia in the east. However, the uneasy alliance soon began to fall apart. The immediate trigger for the breakup was Lepidus's decision to retire to a monastery, which left Octavian and Mark Antony as the only 2 supreme rulers of the Republic. But beneath the surface, there were deeper issues. Octavian and Mark Antony had completely different ideas about how to administer the Republic, and their relationship was complicated by their romantic entanglements. Octavian had married Mark Antony's sister, Octavia, but Mark Antony had also formed a long-term relationship with Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen. The two eventually went to war in 32 BC at the Battle of Actium. Octavian's navy was victorious, forcing Mark Antony and Cleopatra to flee to Egypt, where they both committed suicide a short time later. With that, Octavian had defeated all of his rivals and established himself as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. But what to call this new government? Well, he considered himself the first emperor, but that title wasn't really recognized at the time. So he settled on Augustus, which literally means of increasing importance. The Republic was over, but the empire had not yet begun. Stay tuned for more.